Hey guys, thanks for checking out my channel. Today I'm going to have my favorite actor read the prologue for Cursed. I hope you guys enjoy it. If you do, please like, comment, subscribe, whatever you want to do. You can find more information on my website, www.brentmillerbooks.com. I'll put a link in the description. Thanks.
This will be the prologue for Brent Miller's 2019 book, Cursed. Garrick watched with despair as the moon rose into the sky, once again sealing his fate. Though he hated what he was going to become, he'd nearly given up fighting it. He knew he would never win, and all it caused was more agony. So he followed his friends to the woods, all of them walking in a group, repeatedly scanning the area, assessing his surroundings with each new step. Garrick hadn't seen anyone for a mile, but he wanted to be sure that there were no people anywhere he would feasibly travel. One thing he always knew he could trust was Aldrich's desire to keep them as far away from people as possible. It was vital to protect the public, of course, but themselves as well. Still, he couldn't fight his instincts of confirming that there was no one Aldrich missed. To Aldrich, it was about the pack, and Garrick couldn't shake the feeling that collateral damage may be an acceptable price of keeping them alive. Here, Aldrich growled. The pack spread out, giving themselves space as the moon climbed towards its zenith. Garrick watched as the silvery orb pushed its way higher in the sky. As a child, he'd always looked upon the same sight with joy and wonder. The beauty of the full moon shining, illuminating the night sky, had filled him with a sense of mysticism. It wasn't until recently that his perceptions had been shattered. All he could see now was gray, gloom and darkness, as if the moon itself had lost its shine. Aldrich was the first to change, as always. He was the largest and most powerful of the pack, and Garrick could only assume that helped expedite the process. Whatever beast lurked under Aldrich's skin was strong, so pushing its way to the surface was simple. Of course, it was bound to help that he did nothing to stop it. His teeth grew sharper, and his hair longer. His nails sharpened into claws as he cracked his neck, breaking the bones to allow them to reform according to his new shape. A slight pain was visible on his face. It seemed impossible to avoid that. His entire body was breaking down and being built back up. Even the strongest man would hurt. The pain was to be expected, but what was unsettling to Garrick was the pleasure. Aldrich liked what was happening. Kaelin and Brooke seemed to be one as their bodies started to twitch. They both fell to their knees violently, trying to fight the convulsions that came with the horrifying expansion of bone and muscle. Garrick couldn't tell what made their transformation so much more violent than Aldrich's. Maybe it was just time and experience. They fought back the screams of agony, probably more concerned about appearances than anything else. Kaelin wanted to look strong, and Brooke just didn't want to look weak. Kaelin bit his lip, and Garrick watched as the teeth grew sharper and punctured the skin. As the wound started to bleed, his mouth elongated to allow for the new teeth, slowly forming into a snout. Kaelin's arms bulged, muscles shaping themselves around his already chiseled physique. With a loud snap, Kaelin's legs twisted out of their sockets, and he dropped to the ground, unable to support himself on broken knees. His hands spasmed as he curled them into fists, probably digging claws deep into his palms. Brooke finally released her pent-up scream as she dropped to the ground. She threw her palm out to catch herself, refusing to collapse. When her palm hit the ground, though, there was no semblance of humanity. A light coating of fur had covered her hands, and her fingers shrunk back as the hand itself grew into a paw. Her legs reshaped along with her arms. Her toes stretched, allowing for her to stand again, her toes and front paws on the floor. Hayden gave a short half-smile to Garrick. She watched as he turned away and slammed a fist into a tree. The wood cracked, and Garrick almost feared it would fall over. She knew how much he hated it, and he could feel that she at least didn't get the same sick pleasure that Aldrich did. But she didn't fight it. She never did. Not like him. She screamed. She'd always had the lowest pain tolerance of any of them. Whether she wanted to or not, she couldn't handle the transformation like the others could. Watching the agony on her face just made the entire process worse for Garrick. He hated seeing her like that almost as much as he hated the monsters they'd all become. After the change, though, she was one of the more powerful wolves, only bested by Aldrich and Kaelin. Garrick wondered if that was part of what made the change so hard on her. Hayden's eyes lightened. All the light that the moon had lost had been stolen by her eyes, which shone a tone lighter, more brilliant blue than he'd ever seen. She dropped to all fours as her back broke. Garrick could see the curvature change as it started to reform, and it elongated, protruding from her body. Though the process was fast, he was able to not only distinctively see the bone, but watch as muscle, flesh, and finally fur surrounded her new tail. Her face twisted as it grew and stretched, and her ears grew to a point as fur coated them. Garrick felt the beast pushing its way to the surface. He fought it with all the might he could muster, but he could practically feel claws scratching at his insides. It felt as if the beast threatened to tear him apart, taking his body by force. He saw his pack, 3 of them roaming around him, waiting for him to give up. He could see miles away, picking up the slightest movement through the trees, and he could actually smell the town, although they were far enough out to be confident that none of them would go there in the night. They'd be scared off by the lights and sounds, even of a sleeping town. Still, he could smell the gasoline as cars drove, and, if he tried, he could even hear the voices of people wandering the streets. They lived in a world he'd taken for granted, but would give anything to get back. The city taunted him with the life he'd lost, the smells, the sounds of a world he used to call home. "I know it's hard, Garrick," Chase said, placing a hand on Garrick's shoulder and pulling him out of his self-pity. He was the only one who shared Garrick's hatred of the monsters that hid beneath the surface. "We just have to trust Aldrich." Garrick had trouble with the concept of blind trust. On nights when the moon was full, he lived in a constant fear of harming the innocent. How could he wipe those fears away and simply trust someone who didn't seem to care? Chase removed his hand from Garrick's shoulder quickly as he clenched his teeth and fists. Garrick watched as his jaw expanded, but Chase didn't make a sound. He wasn't the strongest of them all, but he was the best at biting back the pain. He wouldn't let it show. That was a victory that he always tried to keep over the wolf. Even so, Garrick could see it in his eyes. Chase's hands began to bleed as his fingernails grew, but he refused to open his fists. Garrick felt his own canines forcing their way out, and tears formed in his eyes, not from the pain, but from his defeat. It was only a matter of time. Before the change started, he was able to hold on to the admittedly delusional idea that he could stop it. As soon as his body started to transform, though, he knew there was no going back. He dropped to the ground, falling to his hands and knees. Hayden inched closer to him, as she snuggled her body closer to his. She could sense his pain, both physical and emotional. Of course, as his bones were ripped out of their sockets and muscles and tendons were torn, anyone could pick up on it. As his calcaneal tendons snapped, an ear-splitting sound, almost like a gunshot, reverberated through the woods. He could see sadness on Hayden's face, but she just nuzzled her head against him. Garrick's shirt was torn, and he watched as the 3 lines, the scar that had ruined his life, were slowly covered by hair. He saw the muscles in his arms expand and felt them as they tore and reformed. His shoulders dislocated, and he dropped to the ground, unable to hold himself up any longer. He still had some illusion that he could keep it out, but no matter how much he fought, it never stopped anything. It just made the change, and the pain that came with it, last longer. He could see Hayden's pleading eyes, begging him to just let go. Aldrich had disapproval in his gaze. Caitlin was already gone, and Brooke was sniffing for prey. Chase stood tall at Garrick's other side, as if attempting to give Garrick the strength he clearly lacked. Garrick was getting dizzy. He felt himself growing weaker. He knew he couldn't fight it much longer, and he knew that even if he did, it wouldn't matter. He tried to move, but his muscles couldn't produce the force required. Any shred of control he had over his body started to fade, and he started to become a passenger. Garrick was almost able to struggle back onto his hands and knees before he fell to the ground again, as every bone in his leg shattered. He looked up and saw Chase. The only reason he was recognizable was the fact that he was still standing in the same place, not far from Garrick. He stood on all fours, about 4 feet tall from the top of his pointed ears to the bottom of his paws. His tail hung limply behind him, and his neck, which had stretched slightly in the change, was coated in fur, as was most of his snout. The rest of his body had a thin layer of fur, but mostly was just the darkened skin of the wolf. Garrick blinked, and his vision quickly faded. He knew he didn't have control anymore. He looked up at the sky, feeling his face elongate quickly, and he howled. As his calcaneal?
Calcaneal.
As his calcaneal.
Calcaneal.
As his calcaneal. Right?
Yep.
as his calcaneal, as his calcaneal, as his calcaneal tendons snapped,